Armand never imagined that the brother he trusted most, Danish, and the wife he loved deeply, Mewish, would destroy his life with one unforgivable secret, a secret that would tear their family apart forever. David and Emma had been married for 5 quiet years, the kind of couple people in their small Ohio town often admired from afar. Their home sat on the edge of a quiet neighborhood lined with maple trees, a modest but cozy 2-bedroom house with a small garden that Emma tended to every morning. They were not rich, but they had built a life filled with stability and routine. David worked long hours at the local mechanic shop, while Emma managed an online clothing business from home. They were the picture of an ordinary, peaceful life, or so everyone thought. Everything began to change the day David's younger brother, Ryan, arrived at their doorstep with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a defeated look in his eyes. He had lost his job at a construction company and needed a place to stay until he could find another one. David didn't think twice before inviting him in. He had always been protective of Ryan, who was more carefree and easygoing, often drifting from one job to another. David believed this time would be different, that a few weeks of stability might help his brother get back on track. Emma didn't protest. She knew Ryan from before the marriage and had always seen him as a friendly, if somewhat reckless young man. At first, things went smoothly. Ryan was polite, grateful, and eager to help around the house. He cooked dinner sometimes, mowed the lawn, and even offered to help Emma with her business. David felt relieved to have him there. He often returned home late, covered in grease and exhaustion, and it was comforting to know Emma had company. But over time, subtle changes began to take shape, changes so small that at first, David didn't notice. Ryan and Emma started spending more time together. They laughed easily, shared inside jokes, and seemed to understand each other in a way that felt effortless. Emma began dressing up a little more than usual, doing her hair in ways she hadn't bothered to in years. David noticed, but he told himself it was harmless. Maybe she was just feeling better about herself. Maybe Ryan's presence had lifted the quiet loneliness she often felt when David was away for long hours. Still, there was something about the way Ryan's eyes lingered a little too long on her that made David uneasy. Neighbors began to whisper things that David refused to hear. One afternoon, while he was fixing a car outside, an older neighbor, Mrs. Keller, mentioned casually how nice it was to see Emma smiling again, especially with Ryan around so much. The words stuck in his mind like a splinter. He laughed it off, pretending not to care, but that night, as he watched Emma and Ryan talking in the living room, their heads close together, he felt a wave of discomfort that wouldn't go away. The days turned into weeks, and the household rhythm shifted. Ryan seemed to spend less time looking for jobs and more time helping Emma with errands. They went to the grocery store together, sometimes took long walks under the excuse of discussing her business plans. David began to notice the small things: how Emma's phone lit up late at night, how Ryan disappeared at odd hours and returned with vague explanations. But David wasn't the type to accuse without proof. He buried his doubts, convincing himself that his mind was simply playing tricks on him. One evening, David came home early after the shop closed for maintenance. The house was unusually quiet. He found Ryan's truck parked out front but didn't see anyone inside. Then he heard faint laughter coming from the kitchen. He paused for a moment, his heart pounding. As he stepped closer, he saw them, Emma and Ryan, standing too close, their faces flushed, their hands brushing against each other in a way that wasn't accidental. They froze when they noticed him. The room fell silent. Emma quickly stepped back and muttered something about dinner, her voice trembling slightly. Ryan left the kitchen without a word. David said nothing, but that image stayed burned into his mind. From that night on, the house felt different. The laughter that once filled it vanished. Ryan avoided David, spending more time outside or locked in his room. Emma became quiet, distant, and distracted. She avoided eye contact, gave short answers, and often claimed to be too tired to talk. David tried to reach out to ask if something was wrong, but she dismissed his concern every time. He wanted to believe her, but the unease inside him grew heavier by the day. Then one evening, while doing laundry, David found something that shattered his denial. In the pocket of Ryan's jeans was a crumpled receipt from a roadside motel. The date printed on it matched the day Emma had told him she went to visit her friend across town. His hands trembled as he stared at the paper. His mind raced with possibilities, trying to find any explanation other than the one that seemed obvious. He told himself maybe Ryan had met someone else, maybe it wasn't connected to Emma, but deep down he knew. The truth was sitting in his hands, mocking him. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks of the house, every sound amplified by suspicion. Around midnight he heard footsteps, light, careful, and deliberate, moving from Ryan's room to the kitchen. A few minutes later, another set of footsteps followed. His heart pounded so loud he could barely breathe. He wanted to get up, to confront them, but fear held him down. He was terrified of confirming what he already suspected. The next morning, Ryan acted as though nothing had happened. He joked casually, made breakfast, and offered David coffee as if the tension didn't exist. Emma looked pale, her hands trembling slightly as she poured milk into a glass. The air between them was heavy, suffocating, filled with unsaid truths. David forced a smile, playing along, but inside he was falling apart. Days later, Ryan mentioned he had an interview in another city and would be gone for a couple of days. David pretended to be happy for him, but part of him felt a strange mix of relief and dread. When Ryan left, the house fell silent again, but not in the peaceful way it used to be. It was an uncomfortable quiet, filled with the echoes of betrayal that David could no longer ignore. One night, unable to hold it in any longer, David searched through Ryan's belongings. He found pictures on Ryan's phone, pictures of Emma at home, some taken without her noticing, others clearly posed. His hands shook as he scrolled through them. The proof was undeniable now. His wife and his brother had crossed a line that could never be undone. As he sat there in the dark, the glow of the phone screen illuminating his pale face, David felt something inside him break. The life he had built, the trust he had given, the love he believed in, it all crumbled in an instant. Outside, the night was still and cold, but inside that house, the storm had already begun. David didn't know it yet, but the worst was still to come. The betrayal that started in silence was about to erupt into something far more devastating. Something that would change all three lives forever. The morning after David discovered the photos on Ryan's phone, everything felt unreal. The house that once felt warm and familiar now seemed foreign, filled with invisible cracks that only he could see. He moved through the rooms in silence, replaying every memory, every moment that suddenly carried a new meaning. The laughter he once thought was innocent now felt like a cruel echo of deceit. The kindness, the closeness, the small gestures he dismissed as harmless, all of it had been a cover for betrayal. Emma sensed something had changed. David barely spoke, his eyes empty, his movements slow and mechanical. She tried to act normal, preparing breakfast, asking him about work, but his cold silence made her uneasy. She could feel his suspicion in the air, heavy and sharp. Ryan hadn't returned yet from his supposed job interview, and the house was filled with a tense quiet that made every sound feel amplified. For the first time, Emma felt trapped by her own decisions. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and every time she looked at herself in the mirror, guilt stared back. The affair with Ryan had started as something she told herself was harmless, a distraction, a mistake born out of loneliness. David was always gone, exhausted and distant, while Ryan was there, attentive and charming. But what began as comfort turned into obsession. She couldn't deny how alive Ryan made her feel, how dangerous it became to keep pretending nothing was happening. Now that same thrill had turned into a nightmare she couldn't escape. When Ryan returned 2 days later, he was different. The easy smile he always carried was gone. He looked pale and anxious, his words short and clipped. He could feel David's cold stare whenever they were in the same room. At dinner, the tension was unbearable. The clinking of utensils on plates was the only sound between them. Emma kept her head down, avoiding both men, and when she finally excused herself, David's gaze followed her until she disappeared into the hallway. That night, when the house went dark, David sat alone in the living room, staring at nothing. He couldn't bring himself to confront them yet. A part of him wanted to scream, to demand answers, to tear everything apart, but another part was frozen by disbelief. He wanted proof from their mouths, to hear it so he could finally accept it. He decided he would wait. He would let them expose themselves. Over the next few days he watched them closely. He noticed the small details, how Ryan's room door was always slightly open when he left for work, how Emma checked her phone constantly, how she jumped when a message came through. He began to mark the hours she spent outside, the time she claimed to go shopping or meet friends. He even followed her once, parking a block away from the coffee shop she said she was visiting. She never went inside. Instead, he saw her meet Ryan's truck at the edge of town. They sat inside for a long time, their heads close together. He watched them through the windshield until they drove off toward a side road leading to a small motel. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tight that his knuckles turned white. When he returned home that night, he sat in the driveway for an hour, staring at the house. He couldn't bring himself to go inside. He felt like a stranger in his own life. Everything he had worked for, his marriage, his family, his trust was gone. Inside, Emma was waiting for him, pretending to watch TV, her face pale and tired. When he finally walked in, she smiled weakly, but he didn't return it. He went straight to the bedroom, closing the door behind him. Days turned into weeks, and David barely spoke. Emma's anxiety grew unbearable. She knew he had found out, even though he hadn't said it aloud. The silence between them became torture. Ryan avoided her too, sensing that things were collapsing. He wanted to leave but didn't know how. The guilt of what he'd done to his brother ate at him constantly. He couldn't look David in the eye anymore. Every time he saw him, he saw the man he had betrayed. Then, without warning, Emma started feeling ill. At first, she thought it was stress. But the nausea grew worse every morning, and soon she realized it wasn't just anxiety. A doctor's visit confirmed what she feared the most: she was pregnant. Her world stopped. She sat in the doctor's office in silence, staring at the floor as the words echoed in her head. The child could not be David's. She knew the timing too well. For days, she avoided thinking about it, but the truth pressed against her chest until she couldn't breathe. One night, she told Ryan. He went pale, his hands trembling. He couldn't find the words to respond. They both knew what it meant. There was no way to hide this forever. Emma wanted to tell David everything, to end the lies, but Ryan begged her not to. He said they would figure something out, that telling David would destroy them all. But deep inside, he knew it was already too late. Emma tried to hide the changes in her body, but her exhaustion, her mood swings, her constant sickness made it impossible. David noticed, though she refused to tell him what was wrong. He offered to take her to a doctor, but she said she already had. One afternoon, while she was out, David searched her desk for any clue about what was happening. There, tucked between piles of fabric samples and receipts, he found a folded slip from a clinic, a record of a prenatal visit. The date was recent, the name was hers, and the words printed across the paper confirmed his worst nightmare. That night, the walls of his world came crashing down for the final time. He didn't speak, he didn't cry. He simply sat in the dark living room, holding the slip of paper, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock. When Emma walked in, she froze, sensing something was terribly wrong. He didn't look at her. He just sat there, motionless, as the paper slipped from his hands to the floor. She picked it up and saw what he had found. Her knees went weak, her body trembling as tears filled her eyes. She wanted to explain, to say something, but words wouldn't come. The silence between them was louder than anything she could ever say. David finally looked up at her, his face expressionless, his eyes hollow. She saw the man she once loved, but his warmth was gone. The days that followed were unbearable. David stopped sleeping, barely ate, and spent most of his time in the garage, working aimlessly just to escape the house. Emma avoided him, afraid of what he might do if pushed too far. Ryan tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't see him. The guilt was suffocating. Every time she looked at David, she saw what she had destroyed. One evening, Ryan came home to find David sitting on the porch, staring into the distance. The air was thick with tension. Ryan mumbled a greeting, but David didn't respond. For a brief second, Ryan considered confessing, ending the silence, but fear held him back. He walked inside instead, his steps heavy, his heart pounding. That night, David stood by the window, watching the two of them move around the house. He could see every lie, every hidden glance, every shadow of guilt they tried to conceal. He realized that the truth had been living in his house long before he found proof. And now, as he watched the people he loved most crumble under their own deceit, he knew that something inside him had changed forever. The man he was before, the one who trusted too easily, was gone. What was left in his place was someone colder, quieter, and much more dangerous. The night after David found out about the pregnancy, he sat alone in the garage, surrounded by the tools and machines that once brought him peace. The silence was heavy, pressing against him from all sides. He could hear the faint sounds of Emma moving around the house, but her footsteps now sounded distant, hollow, meaningless. Every time he thought about the life growing inside her, his stomach twisted. He knew it wasn't his, and the truth felt like poison in his veins. The betrayal wasn't just an affair, it was a wound that went deeper than words could describe. He stared at his grease-stained hands and thought about all the times he had helped Ryan, all the times he had defended him when others called him reckless. He had opened his home to him, shared meals, shared memories, trusted him like blood should trust blood. And this was what he had received in return: a knife driven straight through his heart by the two people he loved most. Emma spent most of her days locked inside the bedroom, crying quietly when she thought he wasn't listening. She avoided him, unable to face the devastation she had caused. She had stopped trying to explain or deny anything. The truth hung between them like smoke that refused to clear. The silence between them grew darker, heavier, until it became unbearable. Ryan, unaware that David knew everything, kept his distance, spending long hours away from home. But guilt was eating away at him too. He couldn't sleep at night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw David's face, the kindness he had betrayed. He wanted to run away, start over somewhere new, but he couldn't bring himself to leave Emma alone. The secret they shared bound them together in misery. A week passed, and David's rage began to grow into something dangerous. He found himself thinking about what he would do if he confronted them. Sometimes he imagined yelling, demanding answers. Other times, darker thoughts crept in, thoughts that scared him but wouldn't go away. Every night he replayed the same memories, searching for where it all went wrong. The laughter, the dinners, the smiles, it all looked so different now that he knew the truth. Then one evening, David made up his mind. He needed to see it for himself, to witness the betrayal in real time, to destroy any last fragment of denial that still lingered. So he stayed home from work one morning without telling anyone. He parked his truck around the corner, out of sight, and waited. Hours passed, and then he saw Ryan's truck slowly pulling into the driveway. Emma stepped out moments later, her hair tied up, her hand resting briefly on her stomach before she opened the door to let him in. David's vision blurred with rage. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He sat there, shaking, staring at the house that used to be his sanctuary. Every window, every wall, every memory now felt tainted. He wanted to storm inside, to end it all right there. But something inside him told him to wait, to let the truth reveal itself fully. After about an hour, Ryan came out first, glancing nervously around before getting back into his truck. David watched him drive away, then returned home, pretending he had just come back from work. When he entered the house, Emma was in the kitchen, wiping her eyes. The smell of food lingered in the air, but she looked pale and distant. She didn't notice him at first. When she finally turned and saw him standing there, her face went white. David said nothing. He simply looked at her long, cold and hollow. Then he walked past her and went straight to the garage. That silence said more than any words ever could. That night, Ryan received a call from David, asking him to meet in the garage to help with a repair. His voice was calm, steady, and almost too controlled. Ryan hesitated but agreed. He didn't know that by the end of that night, nothing in their lives would ever be the same. When Ryan arrived, the garage was dimly lit. David stood near the workbench. Tools neatly lined up, the sound of the radio playing faintly in the background. He didn't speak at first. Ryan tried to break the silence, asking what needed fixing. David turned slowly, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark with exhaustion and something else, something Ryan couldn't quite name. The quiet stretched between them until David finally asked if he had something to tell him. Ryan froze. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The weight of the truth pressed down on him like a physical force. David stepped closer, his face inches away, and in that moment, Ryan saw the truth in his eyes. He knew everything. The confrontation spiraled fast. David's control shattered as anger and betrayal exploded out of him. He grabbed Ryan by the collar, shoving him against the wall. Tools fell from the bench, clattering to the floor. Ryan tried to explain, tried to calm him down, but David's rage had reached a point of no return. The sound of fists hitting flesh echoed through the garage, followed by a sickening thud. Ryan stumbled backward, hitting his head on the edge of the tool cabinet before collapsing to the ground. For a moment, everything went silent. The radio continued playing softly, the hum of the night pressing against the walls. David stood there, breathing heavily, staring at his brother's motionless body. His mind went blank. The anger drained out of him, replaced by shock and horror. He knelt down, shaking Ryan's shoulder, but there was no response. Blood began to pool beneath his head, dark and spreading across the concrete floor. Emma, hearing the noise, ran out to the garage. When she saw Ryan on the ground, she screamed. Her hands shook as she knelt beside him, her face pale with terror. David stepped back, his chest heaving, his eyes wide as he realized what he had done. Emma shouted for help, her voice breaking with panic. Neighbors heard the noise and called the police. Within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights filled the driveway. Officers stormed in, finding Emma sobbing over Ryan's unconscious body while David stood frozen in shock. They pulled him away, his hands trembling, his face blank. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He just stared at his brother being lifted onto a stretcher, blood smeared across the floor. The image burned into his mind. The ambulance sped away, sirens echoing down the street. David sat in the back of the patrol car, staring through the window as officers read him his rights. The night air was cold, but he didn't feel it. He couldn't feel anything anymore. Inside there was only emptiness. As the car drove off, Emma stood on the porch, holding her stomach, tears streaming down her face. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as the perfect family they once admired fell apart before their eyes. The truth was out now, and there was no way to escape it. The love that once filled that house had turned into something dark, violent, and irreversible. Ryan's life hung by a thread in the hospital, and David's freedom was gone. Emma was left alone, broken and terrified, realizing that every choice she made had led to this moment of destruction. The affair that once felt exciting had become a curse that consumed them all. And as the night deepened, the house stood silent once more, this time not in peace, but in the aftermath of a tragedy that would haunt them forever. As months passed, the tension inside the house became unbearable. Armand started to notice changes in Mawish's behavior. She was quiet, nervous, and avoided looking into his eyes. Her once cheerful presence turned cold and withdrawn. Even at family gatherings, she seemed distant, constantly lost in thought. Armand tried to believe it was just stress or maybe exhaustion, but deep inside, something told him it was more than that. Little did he know, the truth was already starting to surface, and once it did, there would be no turning back. One evening, while Armand was cleaning his wardrobe, he came across an envelope hidden beneath Mawish's clothes. Inside was a small sonography report. The date printed on it hit him like a storm. It was from a clinic visit Mawish had made secretly 2 months earlier. His hands trembled as he looked at the name written on the form. It was hers, and the document clearly stated she was pregnant. Armand's heart began to race. The timeline didn't make sense. He remembered being away for a business trip during that period. The realization made his chest tighten. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Everything started replaying in his mind. The strange glances between Mawish and Danish. The sudden closeness, the way Danish always seemed to show up when Armand wasn't home. It was as if all the missing pieces were falling into place, forming a horrifying picture. He sat there in silence, holding the report, as an icy wave of betrayal washed over him. The thought that his own brother might be the father of his wife's child tore him apart from the inside. Armand didn't confront them immediately. Instead, he watched. Every gesture, every movement, every exchange between Mawish and Danish became evidence in his mind. He noticed how Danish would often volunteer to help Mawish with household chores, how their eyes avoided contact in front of others, and how they both seemed nervous whenever Armand entered the room unexpectedly. The tension grew with each passing day, and so did Armand's fury. He began to sleep less, eat little, and his face showed the silent pain he carried. One night, Armand returned home earlier than usual. As he walked in quietly, he heard soft sounds coming from the guest room. The light was dim, and the door was slightly open. What he saw next shattered him completely. Danish was sitting close to Mewish, their faces tense with fear, whispering in panic. Mewish's hand rested on her stomach protectively as if guarding a secret. Armand froze in the doorway, his mind spinning. He didn't say a word, didn't make a sound. He simply turned away and left the house without them noticing. That night, Armand drove aimlessly through the city, his thoughts dark and twisted. Betrayal from a stranger could be endured, but betrayal from blood was a wound that never healed. The image of his wife and his brother together replayed endlessly in his head. He thought about his parents, who adored Danish and trusted Mewish like a daughter. The shame that would come if the truth ever reached them made his stomach churn. He knew he couldn't hide this forever, but he also couldn't destroy his family in an instant. When he finally returned home, he acted normal. Mewish pretended too, but her nervous glances betrayed her fear. Danish avoided being around for too long, claiming work commitments. Armand, however, was no longer the same man. He was silent but observant, calm but dangerous inside. The quiet before the storm had begun. He secretly took the sonography report and placed it inside his safe, a reminder of what they had done. He knew he had to confirm the truth before deciding what to do next. In the following weeks, Mewish's pregnancy became harder to hide. Her loose clothes and pale face drew attention from the neighbors. Armand finally confronted her by asking her to see a doctor together, pretending to care for her health. Mewish hesitated but agreed, trying to maintain her lie. At the clinic, the doctor mentioned the estimated time of conception, the same week Armand was out of town. Armand's suspicions were confirmed. He left the hospital in silence, his mind made up. He didn't confront them at home. Instead, he planned carefully, waiting for the right moment. Armand started gathering evidence, checking phone records, and even installing a hidden camera in the living room. What he found broke him further: secret messages between Mewish and Danish, calls made late at night, and coded phrases filled with guilt and fear. Every line was proof of their betrayal. Armand's behavior grew colder. He spoke little, smiled less, and spent hours alone. Mewish sensed something was wrong, but didn't dare ask. Danish, too, became uneasy, aware that Armand's silence was far more dangerous than his anger. He tried to distance himself, but it was too late. The trap had already been set, and Armand was waiting for them to make one final mistake. One rainy evening, the house was quiet. Armand sat in the dark, staring at the footage on his phone. Mewish had just left the room where Danish had entered minutes earlier. They spoke in hushed tones, unaware that every second was being recorded. Armand watched them, his breathing heavy, his hands shaking. The evidence was undeniable. There was no escaping the truth anymore. The storm outside mirrored the chaos inside him. He walked to the window and watched the rain pour down, his reflection cold and empty. The life he had built, the trust he had given, the love he had nurtured, all destroyed by the two people he trusted the most. That night, Armand didn't sleep. He sat awake, consumed by rage, betrayal, and heartbreak. He knew what had to be done, and in his mind, there was no turning back now. The next morning he woke up early, calm and eerily composed. Mewish smiled faintly, trying to act normal, but the unease in her eyes was clear. Danish was supposed to visit that evening for dinner. Armand prepared everything himself, every move calculated. By nightfall, the house looked peaceful, but the air was heavy with tension. As the clock ticked closer to Danish's arrival, Armand's heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with purpose. The storm he had held inside for months was finally about to break, and no one in that house would be the same again. That night, the house was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Mewish moved around the kitchen, pretending everything was normal, though her hands trembled slightly every time she reached for something. Danish was expected to arrive any minute. Armand sat quietly in the living room, his eyes fixed on the front door, his expression blank and unreadable. Inside, however, his thoughts were a storm of betrayal, rage, and cold determination. When Danish finally arrived, the air seemed to grow heavier. He greeted his brother awkwardly, his smile forced, his eyes avoiding direct contact. Armand gestured toward the table where dinner was already served. Mawish tried to maintain her composure, but her nervousness was obvious. Every movement, every glance felt like a silent confession. Armand watched them both, noting every flicker of fear in their faces. The calm in his voice, the softness of his tone, only made the tension worse. The dinner passed in near silence. The clinking of utensils echoed through the room, sharp and uneasy. Mawish barely ate, and Danish looked as if he wanted to leave. Armand, however, made sure he stayed. He poured drinks, asked polite questions, and kept a faint smile on his lips. But under that calm exterior was something dark, something that had been building inside him for months. When the meal ended, he stood up slowly and said he had something to show them. He led them both to the living room and turned on the television. On the screen appeared a video from the hidden camera he had installed weeks earlier. The footage showed Mawish and Danish together, their faces filled with guilt, their whispers too intimate to deny. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mewish's eyes widened in horror, and Danish froze, his mouth opening but no words coming out. Armand just stood there, his face cold and expressionless. The truth that they had tried to hide was now staring back at them, impossible to escape. For several seconds, no one moved. Mewish began to cry quietly, her hands covering her face. Danish took a step forward, trying to explain, but Armand raised his hand slightly, not in anger, but in warning. He didn't need to hear anything. The truth had already spoken louder than any words could. Armand walked to the sideboard, opened the drawer, and pulled out the sonography report, the paper that had started it all. He placed it on the table beside the remote control and looked at them both one last time. The silence felt endless. Then, without saying a word, Armand walked out of the house. The heavy rain outside greeted him as he stepped into the darkness. He got into his car and drove aimlessly through the empty streets. The city lights blurred through the raindrops on the windshield. Every memory, every smile, every promise echoed in his mind, now poisoned by betrayal. His chest felt heavy, his hands numb on the steering wheel. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to escape the suffocating pain that had consumed him. Back at the house, Mewish collapsed onto the floor, trembling. Danish tried to comfort her, but fear clouded his face. They both knew things would never be the same again. The truth had come out, and there was no repairing what they had broken. They didn't know where Armand had gone or what he was planning, but the uncertainty terrified them. The next morning, Armand returned home, calm and collected. His eyes were empty, his voice steady. He told them to sit down. He informed Danish that he had already spoken to their parents, not about the affair, but about a job transfer. Danish was to move to another city immediately. The news came as both a shock and a relief. Armand didn't shout, didn't threaten. His calmness was far more frightening. He simply said that Danish should pack his things and leave by evening. Mewish tried to speak, but Armand ignored her. His silence said everything that words couldn't. Danish left later that day, his eyes filled with shame. As he drove away, he glanced back at the house one last time, knowing he would never be welcome there again. Armand stood at the gate, watching him disappear into the distance. The brother he once trusted more than anyone was now gone, not dead, but lost forever. For the next few weeks, the house was cold and quiet. Mewish lived in constant fear, her guilt eating away at her. Armand barely spoke to her. He went to work, came home, and spent most of his nights sitting alone in the living room. The memories haunted him, the laughter they once shared, the dreams they built together, all replaced by the echo of betrayal. Months passed, and Mewish gave birth to a baby boy. Armand didn't come to the hospital. He didn't hold the child, didn't ask about his health. He simply paid the bills and returned home. The truth about the child's father remained unspoken, but both of them knew it too well. The baby's eyes, his features, everything was a cruel reminder of what had been taken from him. One evening, when Mewish returned home from visiting her parents, she found Armand gone. His clothes, his belongings, everything had disappeared. On the dining table was a letter. In it, Armand wrote that he could no longer live surrounded by ghosts of betrayal. He didn't blame her anymore, nor his brother. He simply couldn't bear to stay. He was leaving to start over, somewhere far away, where no one knew his story. Mewish collapsed, clutching the letter, her sobs echoing through the empty house. She realized too late that she had destroyed not only her marriage but also the only man who had ever truly loved her. Danish never returned. He cut off all contact with the family, moving abroad and changing his number. The family never spoke of what happened, burying the scandal in silence. Years later, neighbors would still whisper about the tragedy of that house, how a quiet, loving couple had been torn apart by betrayal, how a brother had ruined his own family for a moment of weakness. The baby grew up without knowing the full truth about his father, while Mewish lived each day haunted by the memories of the choices she made. Armen never came back. Some said he remarried and built a new life far away. Others believed he lived alone, still haunted by the ghosts of his past, but no one ever really knew. The only thing that remained certain was that one secret had destroyed 3 lives forever: a brother's betrayal, a wife's weakness, and a man's shattered heart. The tragedy of their story became a quiet warning in their town, a reminder that betrayal doesn't always end with violence, but with silence that kills slowly, every single day. And in that silence the echoes of what was lost never truly fade.